came here to build the new Chicano movement. That's what we came here for. We came here to build the new Chicano movement. That's what we came here for.
Bryant, to shot!
Hey everyone, Miguel Garcia. Welcome to another episode of the Sports as a Weapon podcast. A Chicano sports podcast on the entanglement of sports, radical politics, and working class sports fan culture. And don't worry, we talk about just sports too. I'm very excited to be back. It's been a long time since I've recorded new episodes. The last episode was October 2023. We spoke about Palestine right in the beginning after October 7th. And then I went on a little hiatus, didn't plan to go on a hiatus this long, and then some personal stuff happened. I just became a new father, so it's been about 5 weeks. So just a lot of things were going on this past 10 months. And then now, it's funny because now I'm recording an episode now that the baby's here. But yeah, that's some personal news for all you listeners out there, and that's pretty much one of the main reasons I was on a hiatus. But very excited to be back recording an episode. Very special guest we are having on the podcast today. He's a returning podcast guest. I think this might be the second or third person that's been on my podcast more than once. So very exciting to have someone that's been on the podcast before. We're going to talk about the Paris 2024 Olympics and all the politics around that. Everything that went on during the Olympics, what's to come with the 2028 Los Angeles Olympics. I'm very excited to have this guest on. Before I introduce him, the Sports as a Weapon podcast is part of the ANTICONQUISTA media collective. ANTICONQUISTA is an anti-imperialist media collective. Our content is produced by and for the Latin American and Caribbean diaspora. We are dedicated to exposing and fighting the capitalist imperialist system, root cause of our displacement. Subscribe to the ANTICONQUISTA Patreon at Patreon.com/ANTICONQUISTA and follow ANTICONQUISTA on YouTube, Twitter, now X, and Instagram. Subscribe to our podcast, the Sports as a Weapon podcast, on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and wherever you get your podcasts. Today's guest is Dr. Jules Boykoff. He is an author of many books, one of them being No Olympians Inside the Fight Against Capitalist Mega Sports in Los Angeles, Tokyo, and Beyond. Power Games, A Political History of the Olympics. I know he has a new book, and then he could talk about it a little bit right now. So there's some new books he's written. He's appears on The Nation, Time Magazine, a lot of places. Very excited to have him back on the podcast to give us a report back what happened at the Olympics. And he is a political science professor at Pacific University in Oregon. Thank you, Jules Boykoff. Thank you again for coming on the podcast.
It's my pleasure, Miguel, and congrats on everything that's so exciting that's happening in your life right now.
Oh, yeah, and thank you again for coming on the podcast. You were the first person I thought about that I should contact to see if you want to come on the podcast again to talk about this topic, the Paris 2024 Olympics, and then just the Olympics in general. To me, you're one of the top experts on this topic when it comes to the spectacle of the Olympics and how it impacts working class, poor people, marginalized people, and the impacts on the environment, capitalism, all these issues. The Olympics has a huge negative impact. So I want to get into it right away. You spoke about this on The Nation with your articles you did with Dave Zirin while you were there at the Olympics. But can you speak about the surveillance, the policing, and the social cleansing of marginalized Parisians? I also read there's like a Olympic Games law, like a contract. So if you could speak on that and then what was happening while you were there.
Absolutely, Miguel. So we've been to numerous Olympics before, Dave Zirin and I, and so we're no strangers to the security architecture that gets built up around the Olympic Games. But even for us, after attending numerous Olympics in the past, we were struck by how in your face and militarized the police presence was in Paris. Basically, it was a policing convention at times. And Dave and I were doing quite a bit of reporting. We were writing for The Nation. We were also putting together these segments for the Real News Network, where he has a show, Edge of Sports TV. And we noticed over time that every single time we did an interview, we were interrupted by a police siren. The police siren was essentially the soundtrack to the 2024 Olympics. And there were police pretty much on every corner. There were police from more than 40 countries around the world that also joined to make sure that nothing happened terrorism-wise. But here's the thing. The security architecture that is built up to make sure that terrorism doesn't happen at the Olympics can be flipped easily and used against activists who are just expressing their feelings about the Olympic Games. And we saw this happen. We were taking this thing called the Toxic Tour, put together by some anti-Olympics activists from a group called Saccage 2024. And on their toxic tours, they're basically informational tours for visiting journalists and for other people that just want to learn about the social and environmental toxicities that were popping up in this northern part of the city called Saint-Denis, where there was a lot of gentrification around the Olympics, a lot of working class folks getting pushed out in order to create the Olympic Village where the athletes stayed. And so we joined at this one metro stop, Dave Zirin and I, with some other journalists that were going to go on the tour. And we were waiting on two other journalists and an activist, and they just never showed up. And it turns out when they popped out of the metro station, 4 police cars swooped in on them, and dozens of police officers popped out. And they detained these individuals, again, 2 journalists and this activist, and they detained them for 10 hours and engaged in intense questioning. They searched their belongings, found some anti-Olympic stickers, which, by the way, are not against the law in France, but really made their day difficult. And if you thought that was enough, it's too bad, because the same thing happened. They came around, they were going to have another toxic tour, this one ironically about police repression. And when they popped out of the metro and they started the tour, this young activist, his name is Noah Farhone, we interviewed him a couple times, was once again detained, this time for 7 hours instead of 10. And so this is something we've seen time and again with the Olympics. Is not necessarily just a Paris thing, but the architecture that's built up to supposedly stop terrorism all too often is turned against activists who are just expressing their feelings about the Olympics, even legally speaking. The other thing I just would say about the security architecture is that, it tends to stick around after the Olympics. They don't put it back in the box. The piece of legislation that you mentioned, Miguel, is super important. It was a law, the Olympic law, passed about a year and a half before the Olympics by the French National Assembly. And that law included a provision for algorithmic video surveillance, making France the first country to greenlight algorithmic video surveillance, AI-powered video surveillance. And this was incredibly controversial. What they did was they said that there'd be an end date, a sunset date in March 2025. And when you hear that, Miguel, you're probably like, well, that's kind of a long ways after the Olympics. It is. It's like way after the Olympic Games. This is one of those battles that I think people should be paying attention to, because all too often, the new technologies that are soft launched to police the Olympics become part of a normalized, racialized policing regime in the wake of the games. So I'm going to be really interested to see the debate that happens in Paris and France more widely about whether to keep this technology after the sunset date in March 2025 in terms of security in Paris. It was intense. It was even more intense in your face than places we've been like Rio, like London, and it was plenty intense there. It was very striking to anybody who was in the Olympic city.
Okay, so from your experience, you've been to previous Olympics in other countries. This was one of the more intense when it comes to surveillance and policing.
No doubt about it. And then guys, just big buff guys walking around with military grade weaponry that you might see like in Afghanistan or Iraq, not necessarily what you would expect on the streets of Paris.
Yeah, now I think I read somewhere that they had police from other countries there at the Olympics as well, like helping out.
They sure did. Around 40 countries worth of police sent there.
So, this is just, they're just, obviously they're getting outside police from other countries. This kind of shows you how a lot of these countries like the US, France, the UK, the big global powers from the West are like, they have a surveillance apparatus where they're all together, right? So very interesting when it comes to these Olympics, because the next Olympics, they're coming over here. We're already seeing the preparations for the 2028 Olympics. it's going to intensify the surveillance, the policing, especially how we already do it here in the U.S. So that's something I thought about with the next Olympics. You and Dave also talked about the panopticon of the Olympics, if you want to talk about that a little. So Michel Foucault. Right?
Yeah, kind of a shout out to Jeremy Bentham, who first created the panopticon that Michel Foucault made famous in his theoretical writings. It's just the idea that you're a sort of prisoner in a sort of metaphorical way, forever being surveilled and therefore forever modifying your own activities because you feel the eye of the state surveilling you. And yeah, it just definitely felt like a panopticon at times in Paris. And the big question that civil libertarians who we interviewed, such as Noémie Lévin of La Quadrature du Net, this really great group in Paris that does a lot of watchdogging around surveillance and high tech industry. You know, she was telling us that her big fear was that they were going to use the Special Olympic law to get through algorithmic video surveillance and then use that in turn as the gateway for facial recognition technologies, which, as you'll know, Miguel, are extraordinarily problematic on numerous levels, including the fact that they're less accurate around people of color. So there's all these false positives all the time with people of color. And so that was a big concern of hers moving forward. But I think how the Olympics fall into that is they just create this once in a generation opportunity for security forces at the national and local level to leverage the moment to get all the special weapons, laws, gear that they would never be able to get during normal political times. And so that's exactly what we saw in Paris. It became sort of this new wave panopticon of sorts.
I want to just mention how, if people aren't familiar, the same thing happens with the NFL and the Super Bowl. They have a similar surveillance apparatus when it comes around the Super Bowl. I actually did my master's research on the city of San Jose and Santa Clara in 2016 when they had the Super Bowl there in the Bay Area, how they created these ordinances specifically for the Super Bowl, where they pretty much kind of like here in Paris in the Olympics, where they wanted to social cleanse marginalized people. With the Super Bowl, it's very similar. They didn't want undocumented street vendors, homeless people, unhoused people, etc., within the parameters of where the Super Bowl is taking place or where they have their Super Bowl event, like week events, and it just continues, that's exactly what I looked at. I looked at how they used those same tactics of surveillance to police the street vendors at a Christmas event that they have every year. That's a big event in San Jose. And so it continues. They don't usually stop it.
Yeah, that's really important. I bet a lot of people are going to be returning to that research that you're doing the closer we get to Los Angeles to figure out those dynamics. Because in addition to local ordinances, are the ones that you studied and documented, there's also this thing called the National Special Security Event, which is a federal law that gets put into place around things like the Super Bowl, Olympics, soccer World Cups, big events in the United States. They're National Special Security Events, or NSSEs. And this involves more than 12 federal agencies that basically get free reign in the city where the event is happening. And that includes often ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Of course, that's going to be a really big issue down in Los Angeles, where you have a lot of folks that are living there who are undocumented. And all of a sudden, ICE is going to have free reign. And I say going to have, they already have. They declared the National Special Security Event to be started already. I have never in all my days seen a National Special Security Event that starts 4 years ahead of the actual event. So that's going to be a place, unless something changes, for the next 4 years for people in the Los Angeles area.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that law up, because I remember speaking about this the last time we were on the podcast, and when we had our friends from the No Olympics Los Angeles on my podcast as well, and they spoke about that. Yep, so that law's already in place. Yes, this is all connected with all these sporting events. Like the World Cup's going to be coming to the United States in 2026, and it's going to be in Los Angeles as well for some of the first round, like the beginning of the World Cup. So that's going to be a test run for the Olympics for them as well, for that event. So it's all coming up in the next 4 years. I hope by then maybe I have time and I might go down there and try to cover it for my podcast in the future, like you and Dave do and a lot of people do. So that's a few years away, but it's something that's already happening that they're preparing in Los Angeles. Like they're already talking about, we'll talk about it later, but they're talking about how there's going to be no cars involved, no car Olympics. I don't know how that's going to happen. in Los Angeles, but talk about that in a little. Now I want to talk about this topic, the biggest topic to me going on in the world right now, what's happening with Palestine and Gaza, the war against the Palestinian people. At the Olympics, there was a lot of Palestinian support protests at the Olympics. You and Dave Zirin wrote a lot about that in The Nation while you were there. Can you speak about the Palestine protests and just what was happening at the Olympics with Palestine?
Absolutely. And it was really striking to both of us how much support and love there was in Paris for Palestinian people in general, but also the Palestinian athletes who were participating. Dave and I went to track and field one night, and we had the privilege of watching Layla Al-Masri run the 800 meters for Palestine and set a national record, which was pretty amazing to do when you think about the pressures on Gaza that are happening right now and how much that must have been difficult and weighing on her mind as she ran, but set a national record. And everywhere we went around town, we saw pro-Gaza graffiti, stickering. It became like a little side hobby of ours to take photographs of that. We have tons of photos of that all around Paris. On the night before the official opening ceremony of the Olympics, there was a large counter-Olympics protest event in Place de la République, this big area where there's a lot of protests in Paris. And there's more than 1,000 people there by a lot, including a huge contingent of people that are in favor of Palestinian liberation. And you saw the sort of counter-Olympics protest merge with this pro-Palestinian crowd into this really huge crowd that was cheering on all the speakers and supporting each other. And so this was a big element of being in Paris, at least on the ground. I understand it wasn't covered quite as much on, say, NBC here in the United States. But if you're actually on the ground in Paris, there was a lot of love for Palestine and a lot of respect for the fact that they managed to bring 8 athletes to Paris, despite everything that's happening in Gaza and also the West Bank right now. Last point on this is that we went to a local restaurant bar to watch the opening ceremonies. And there were 2 big cheers that came out from the very young, kind of like 20 to 25-year-old, very cool crowd that was around us. The 2 biggest cheers, one was when the Palestine team floated by on the boat, and the other was when Celine Dion gave this incredible rendition of the song. So just to give you an idea that, there was a lot of support and love for Palestine, for what's happening right there as we speak.
Yeah, and it was very evident. You could see at the Olympics, following the Olympics, and you could tell, obviously the mainstream U.S. media was trying to hide the fact that there's a lot of Palestinian support at the Olympics and protesting. Everything gets put on social media, and that's how everyone was able to follow along with that. Just like how we're fortunately being able to, it makes me so angry, but we're openly seeing a genocide live stream to us, like through social media. Everything's on there, so the good and the bad. But the good part was on social media, everyone was talking about Palestine at the Olympics.
Oh, just real quick, I was going to say, a big topic of conversation in Paris was also like Russia was excluded from the Olympics, at least from participating under their own flag. So I would see stickers like Russia is excluded, but Israel gets to just show up and participate under its own flag. So I was talking a lot about that. People really interested in asking and discussing the details of that and doing a comparison between Russia and Israel, even though obviously they're not the same situation. I mean, that's not how history works, where it just gives you these crisp, identical twins, but they're similar enough where you can level a comparison. And if you look at what the International Olympic Committee gave as the reasons for banning Russia, it was 2 things. One was that they broke the Olympic truce when they invaded Ukraine between the Beijing Olympics and Paralympics. Well, Israel's openly violating the Olympic truce on a daily basis during the Paris Games. And the other reason that the IOC, International Olympic Committee, gave was that Russia had taken over territory in Ukraine where there were sporting clubs and they were using them for their own devices. And if you look at Gaza, and the biggest sport in Gaza is soccer, all the soccer stadiums and fields are unplayable now. Many of them just totally decimated. According to some reporting by people like Karim Zidane and others, a Yarmouk Stadium, the most storied stadium in Gaza, was being used by the Israeli Defense Forces to detain and interrogate Palestinians. And while it's not the exact same thing as the Russian Olympic Committee taking over 4 territories inside of Ukraine and running the sports clubs there, it is similar enough to where you might think the International Olympic Committee would be forced to make a public statement. They just really weren't willing to engage at all. They were just like, no, we're not going to even entertain the idea that people were floating that maybe Israel too, like Russia, should be forced to participate as, quote, individual neutral athletes. I mean, let alone banning. I mean, that just wasn't on the table at all. Yet a lot of people were pointing out those contradictions, knowing full well that they're obviously not the same exact situation.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, because that was what we're going to talk about during the Olympics. Like, there's been a call to ban them from the Olympics, but as you mentioned, there's this hypocrisy where Russia has been banned, but Israel hasn't. And so that hypocrisy is right there wide open for everyone to see because they didn't do anything about it. There's so many athletes that are representing Israel that are participating in killing Palestinians, like, while being in the military.
Yeah, that's a really important point you're making too,
ahead.
Miguel, because the athletes from Russia who did participate in Paris, there was around a dozen of them in total. They were intensely vetted by the International Olympic Committee to make sure that they weren't engaging in warlike behavior, right? So that was exactly what you're pointing to, was exactly one of the criteria that was used to exclude athletes from Russia who all would have otherwise qualified to participate in the Olympics. They weren't even allowed to participate as individual neutral athletes. And like you said, I mean, you had a judoka from Israel who actually signed one of the bombs going to Palestine and like gleefully supporting some brutal attacks and yet not a word. So, that's why when we were in Paris, there were so many people that were trying to raise that question, ask about this double standard that was clearly in play. And to the frustration of many, just the International Olympic Committee was just not willing to entertain those questions in a serious way at all.
Another big thing is since October 7th, Israel has killed so many among all the thousands and hundreds, more than likely 100,000s of Palestinians that were killed. A lot of them have been athletes. They've killed a lot of Palestinian athletes too. I know there's a few pages on social media, Sporting Palestine, I believe there's a couple other ones that talk about Palestine and sports and talk about all the things that are happening, the good and the bad. But yeah, they've killed a lot of Palestinian athletes too, as well.
Including a lot of Olympic level athletes. So you might have thought that when the former Olympic soccer coach from Palestine gets killed by the Israeli Defense Forces, or when 2 volleyball players that could have made the Olympics get killed, that the International Olympic Committee would have an interest in making a comment or maybe a mini investigation. But they really decided not to engage at all, and instead decided to put all their efforts toward making Israeli athletes feel as comfortable as possible. And you don't want anything happening to athletes. You don't want athletes being in danger at the Olympic Games. At least I don't. So I understand why they might want to make sure all the athletes are safe. Of course they do. But it's not an either or. I mean, you can do that and raise some questions about some of the things that they've done. And the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, definitely chose not to do that.
Well, the last episode I did was specifically on Palestine, and in here, again, this is a big topic we're talking about here with the Olympics too. It's almost been a whole year already. Going to another topic that made a lot of us angry. A lot of bigots were after this Algerian boxer. Can you speak about Iman Khalif?
Absolutely.
I don't know if I said her name right.
Before I talk about Khalif, I just want to say a lot of people share your frustration, Miguel. And one story that Dave Zirin and I wrote that is, I think, quite inspiring is we got to interview Fadi Deeb, the one and only Paralympian that's representing Palestine at the 2024 Paralympics. We sat with him in a Turkish restaurant where the Turkish guys running that place just totally adored him, just treated us like champions. And we had this very moving conversation with Fadi about his life, his family in Gaza. He's from Gaza, and what he's doing now to make sure that people remember that Palestine is still alive. Palestine is fighting, and he's there. He's going to carry the flag at the Paralympics representing Palestine. So that's something to look forward to and to cheer for. He's an amazing man. I hope people will check out that interview if you want to be inspired.
Yeah, and thank you for bringing that up, because he is the only athlete at the Paralympics from representing Palestine. People don't know I was born with a disability, so something like that's pretty big to me, something very important as
Mm-hmm.
well. I was born with cerebral palsy, so that's a big topic, and I'm glad you brought that up, that he's representing Palestine. It's taking a lot of courage for him to do that.
Absolutely.
Hopefully he does well at the Paralympics.
Yeah, let's cheer on Fadi D. No question about it, Miguel.
Yeah, and I'll put that article you wrote in our show notes.
Oh,
Dave
thanks.
wrote about
I appreciate that. Yeah. And
your
we
interview.
also put up a video interview up at the Real News Network if you want to see Dave talking to him. It's really moving. Highly
Okay,
recommend it.
okay.
Now, in terms of this boxing champion from Algeria, Mani Khalif, winning the gold medal under all this global scrutiny, first of all, just congratulations on winning a gold medal. I mean, that's an accomplishment in and of itself. Setting aside the ridiculous and confected thunderstorm that emerged around her. Now, let's be clear. Imani Khalif is a woman, has always been a woman, cisgendered woman from day one. But her looks apparently didn't conform to the Eurocentric vision of many people who started to either say, well, actually, she's not a she, she's a biological male. No evidence of this, by the way. Or saying that she was trans, which she's not. I support him 100%, but this boxer was not a trans person. And basically, they went in really hard on her online, and people like J.K. Rowling was saying all manner of unfounded information. What happened was the International Boxing Association, the IBA, had stated in public that this boxer, as well as another one from Taiwan, had failed some unspecified test in the past. They didn't give any information really about the test, what it was about, nothing. The IBA is not exactly an organization to be trusted. The Olympic sphere is notorious for corruption, including the International Olympic Committee has had some serious bouts with corruption. But in the International Olympic Committee's 130-year history, they've never banned an international sports federation ever, 130 years. And with all the corruption brewing in these spaces, it's kind of amazing. Well, the IBA became the first to get banned. That's how totally corrupt they were. And this was the group that was issuing these statements saying that there was a problem with Khalif as well as the boxer Lin from Taiwan not giving any information, but it didn't matter. At this point, you know how it works, Miguel. Like the right wing just glommed onto it and started saying all these things that absolutely weren't true, harassing these people online as well. And it looks like now Mani Khalif might get her due. I think she's going to sue the pants off of people like Elon Musk and J.K. Rowling. So, maybe she'll eventually get her due. So hell of a wild ride there. But for me, what's impressive, just from a sheer athletics perspective, is that despite the firestorm around her, she just maintained total focus and won the gold medal. So, I mean, just total credit to her. And last point on this, I interviewed this amazing journalist from France. Her name is Faiza Zerwala, and she's of Algerian descent. And she was so excited about the fact that Khalif managed to fight through all this Islamophobia, sexism, anti-trans discourse, and represent Algeria so well. And so, like, there's a lot of people out there that was supporting Khalif. We shouldn't forget that amid the sort of awful people that were on the attack.
Yeah, and I'll also post a link to that article because people need to read that article you and Dave wrote about her as well. All this attention from this firestorm created not by her, just from bigots, brought up the racism, misogyny, the transphobia, everything from those bigots came out just because she beat an Italian woman who's actually a cop who has done something similar in other fights where she's given up mid-fight, and she's also supported the right-wing president of Italy. All the bigots come out, and she still wins the gold. That's a champion right there. Talking about sports and athletes and like having that strong will, not just your athletic ability, but that mentality to still be able to withstand all that from the outside and still win a gold medal for her country as well. It was this amazing story after all the BS she had to go through.
Yeah, it was a big Olympics for Algeria in a lot of ways. I mean, there was also during the opening ceremony when the Algerians were floating down the River Seine, there was this area at this one particular bridge where in 1961, numerous Algerians during the Algerian Revolution against French colonial domination were killed by French police. Many of them then drowned right there in this spot. And there was this beautiful moment during the opening ceremony when the Algerian athletes in the Olympics floated by and they left these roses as a sort of way of honoring these martyrs. And so again, just like a lot of history between Algeria and France, to say the least. These confected controversies lacquered on top of that already frictive and conflictual history. There was a lot going on with Algeria at these Olympics, and it was all really interesting too.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up because France colonized Algeria, and to see Algeria win in Paris after all that it's awesome. Can you speak about Jibril Rahoub? But you wrote the article. He's the head of pretty much the head of the sports federation in Palestine. Can you speak about your interview you and Dave did with him, and then what happened afterwards after your article came out as well?
Absolutely. So Jibril Rajoub is the head of the Palestinian Olympic Committee, also has a big important role in the soccer federation for Palestine, and 71-year-old man who's seen many things over the course of his life. He spent time in jail for throwing a grenade at Israelis when he was just a very young person. So he's got one heck of a history. Went on hunger strike when he was in prison. But now in his older years, he said to us that he realized that sports can be this really powerful way of pushing for justice. That is exactly what he's now dedicated his life to doing. And for him, it was a no-brainer question as to whether Israel should be able to participate in the Olympics. He told us that he felt like Israel had violated the Olympic truce, and just including standards of decency. And so he was spending a lot of time at these Olympics lobbying other Olympic officials and trying to persuade them of his point of view. And so we got to sit down with him and interview him. I think it's worth going and looking at the videotape because this man just holds so much gravitas in his voice and has so much experience behind him. Even if you happen to disagree with what he says, he's certainly worth listening to no matter what. And on the day that our piece was published, he was traveling back to Palestine, where Israel detained him, temporarily took his passport, and said that he had to return for questioning a couple days later for further questioning at a notorious military base known for mistreating detainees. Last I heard, he was not going to conform to the demand. And I await further knowledge from the people who are on the legal team for the Palestinian Olympic Committee. But as far as I know, he's safe right now and he's not in detention. But it's just a good reminder that when you do speak out for what you believe in the context of the Israel-Palestine struggle, that you do make a big risk. And if anyone understood that, it was Mr. Rajoub, who's got a long history of understanding that real risk. And so I'll be very interested to see what happens in the wake of his temporary detention. I'm eager to see, Miguel, what happens.
We'll probably hear something in the near future with that. As we've mentioned, Israel's just been targeting Palestinians that are, athletes that are part of the sports in Palestine. And this is just another example. And you brought up his struggle since he was a child, living under the occupation of Israel and apartheid. He's pretty much why I named my podcast, or just this whole thing called Sports as a Weapon, because he's using sports as a weapon to push for that change. He's, as you mentioned, pushing to try to ban Israel from all these mega sporting events. And that's obviously why he's been targeted by getting detained when he came back from Paris. But yeah, it's going to be interesting to continue to follow that. And hopefully everything turns out well and Israel doesn't detain him again. Palestinians are getting detained regardless, but they're targeting people like this because they know he has the power to influence some change through sports, through soccer. So just hopefully everything's okay. We talked about Palestine a lot on this podcast because it's a big topic overall in the world, and especially at the Olympics. I wanted to have you on because you and Dave spoke about it a lot through your articles. So now to our last topic, kind of want to look at what you think of the Olympics in the future. In the next 4 years, it's coming to Los Angeles in 2028. There's already the preparation from the city for the Olympics that's already impacting marginalized people in Los Angeles and continuing that marginalization that the Olympic project does whenever it rolls through a city. We could speak about LA 28 Olympics, what's going on there right now could happen when it gets here, the Olympics, the future Olympics in general.
Yeah, your listeners probably remember if they watched the closing ceremony, LA Mayor Karen Bass accepting the Olympic flag and waving it right there on stage before, I guess, Tom Cruise took it off and flew it across the world to Los Angeles. But that's when things just started getting real for LA. It's only 4 years until Los Angeles hosts the Olympics. And a lot of the things that I saw in Paris, I think will be really useful to keep in mind for folks in Los Angeles as the games get closer. One of the things that I found really amazing about Paris was there was a group that organized only less than a year before the Olympics called Le Revers de la Médaille, the other side of the medal. And they were working with migrants and unhoused people who are living on the streets of Paris, who are either trying to get political asylum or become, get legal residency in the country. And they were basically pushed out of the city as the Olympics got closer. The displacement of these poor, marginalized peoples intensified, some 39% more in the year before the Olympics than prior years. 12,500 plus people pushed off the streets of Paris onto buses and sent to other parts of the city. This group did an amazing job organizing and getting the message out both before and then during the Olympics. But Dave and I interviewed numerous people from that group, and they told us their one regret was that they didn't start earlier. They did this report, which really broke down the numbers that really cut through and made a lot of media. And I just think if I'm in LA, I would be trying to really put together some reports and some plans for what I can do to get the word out about the issues that I care about, whether it's the intensification of policing, whether it's a fear of how unhoused people in LA are going to be treated in the context of the Olympics. I think those are both very real concerns. Another thing that we learned in Paris was that any self-respecting union in Paris used this once-in-a-generation opportunity to make massive gains for their members, whether it was garbage collectors who threatened to go on strike during the Olympics and they got a pay raise, whether it was train drivers who did the exact same thing and got a huge boost in their pension. And we interviewed Axel Persson from the CGT and talked about exactly, how he managed to do this. Police did it as well. Honestly, police unions leveraged the moment. And so I think in Los Angeles, it'll be really interesting to see how far organized labor is willing to go to help their members. Because as I say, this is a once in a generation opportunity to make gains for your membership. And I think it'd be ridiculous to try to squander it. We saw a fair amount of anti-Olympics activism in Paris before the games and also during the games. And Los Angeles is home to a really smart and spirited group of activists. They've been on your show before. I know, Miguel, the people from No Olympics LA. And if people don't know about them, I really urge you to check them out. They got a great website, high information website. And they've been fighting against the Olympics in Los Angeles for darn near a decade now. And they're revving up their machine to make a push toward the 2028 finish line. And they're definitely not giving up the closer that we get. And so you can see the juggernaut on the tracks rolling toward Los Angeles right now, but it's definitely not going to be an uncontroversial Olympics for the reasons I've already talked about: police intensification. President Donald Trump, when he was president, sat down with Casey Wasserman, who was the chair of the LA 28 Olympics, and he promised Casey Wasserman, whatever it takes, we'll give you from the federal budget to police the Olympics. I'm going to guess that's probably around $2 billion, $3 billion. It's not like they're actually trying to cut corners on that stuff. So you add that to the price tag, which is already 6.9 million. It was originally supposed to be 5.3, and you're almost doubled the price tag already, and we're still 4 years out. So there's just a lot of big questions that are looming around the Olympics. And No Olympics LA is fighting. There's a lot of celebrities who have woken up to the reality that the Olympics aren't exactly what they are cracked up to be in the mainstream press. You had John Mulaney in his recent LA special do something critical about the upcoming LA Olympics. And so I think there'll be kind of a culture battle around these games as well. And so, I'm eager to follow it as it unfolds. And as I'm sure you are too, Miguel, you got to get back down there to your old stomping grounds and start digging around and creating some important interviews and content down there. But yeah, I know you and I are both interested in following this as it moves forward.
Yeah, we have 4 years to go. They're already talking about how it's going to be a carless Olympics. I don't know how they're going to make that happen in Los Angeles. I'm from Southern California. The public transportation there is already terrible throughout all Southern California. The light rail there, the subway there doesn't go very far. It doesn't go too many places. I don't know how they're going to.
Yeah.
And then we also saw a couple weeks ago, Gavin Newsom cleaning trash and taking unhoused people's like stuff, clearing them out for like their whole new law. They're trying to Newsom pass that thing where he's not going to give funding to cities unless they take care of the homeless problem, right? And so we see a video of him helping that out. To me, that's all connected to the Olympics as well, because it's all in preparation for that. Because it's not going to be Los Angeles. They're going to use Southern California in general for a lot of the events. I grew up in San Bernardino, Riverside area. The Ontario airport is right there. It's one of the other local SoCal airports. Apparently they're going to use that, and they're going to use part of Ontario to host people there, like maybe for hotels. Like they're going to be busing Olympians all the way 30 miles to Los Angeles. So it's going to not just be LA. They're going to be using other cities in Southern California that surround Los Angeles.
Mm-hmm. My big concern is that
Against
they're
it.
just going to mistreat. It's going to be a human rights violation festival, because if Karen Bass was in Paris and saw the way that they basically rolled in security in the middle of the night at these encampments of unhoused people and just stuffed them on buses and sent them away, I hope she doesn't take the lesson that that's going to fly here in California. And so there's going to be a big fight on our hands just to make sure that everybody keeps their dignity, even if they happen to be unhoused at that moment. And so we need a better plan than the one we have. And let's not forget, Karen Bass's predecessor, Eric Garcetti, got on late night television with Seth Meyers and said, by the time the Olympics roll around in 2028, there will no longer be homeless people in Los Angeles. That would be wonderful if it were true, but we are definitely not on track to see that before the Olympic Games start. So there's a lot of work to be done, like you're saying.
Yeah, and before we go, that was another reason why stadiums, there's a lot of new stadiums being built in Los Angeles the last 5 years. Obviously, they're specific to teens, but they were also part of the bigger plan for the Olympics. Like the Clippers are just opened their new arena in Inglewood, Intuit Dome, with their billionaire owner from Microsoft, Steve Ballmer. We have the Rams and Chargers. They already have SoFi Stadium that's going to be used. That got built a couple years ago. We have the soccer stadium that the LAFC and Angel City FC play at. That's a new stadium. Then there's all the other ones, Dodger Stadium. There's a lot. So that was another reason for all those new stadiums that got built. And in Inglewood, there's 2 new ones, obviously, and that displaced a lot of people in Inglewood. So it's all connected, and it's leading up to the Olympics in 2026. And I mean, World Cup in 26, and then the Olympics in 28, which will be even bigger than the World Cup, even though the World Cup's pretty huge. I feel like the Olympics is going to be even crazier than the World Cup in 26, because the World Cup's kind of spread out throughout the U.S., Canada, Mexico. But yeah, we'll probably have you on the podcast again to talk about this stuff in the next 4 years, as long as I keep going with this podcast, because there's going to be more things happening in the next 4 years. So I thank you for coming on the podcast, Jules. It's a pleasure having you on my podcast. I'll put the information on your newest book. I spoke about some older ones right now in the intro, but you could speak about anything new right now before we go.
Yeah, sure. I mean, my new book is called What Are the Olympics For? So it's a short book that is designed to be an critical introduction to the Olympics for the thinking sports fan. And so if you know anybody out there that might want to start thinking critically about the Olympics, they might love the athletes like I do. I mean, but they think that there's these horrible injustices bricked into the Olympics. This might be the book for them. It's short, written for a general audience. Yeah, what are the Olympics for? I feel really good about it. So thanks for that opportunity to mention it.
Yeah, Jules. And then I'll put some information on your other books that people should read. There's a lot of them. Cover a lot of the stuff from the Olympics. That's why you're on here. To me, you're like one of the top experts on this. So I'm glad you come on my podcast to talk about it, because people could learn on what's going on with the Olympics. What's all the negative stuff besides the good things when we like to watch sports as a sports fan. But there's all these things entangled into it that comes from capitalism, racism, the from broader society. We'll have you again on the podcast.
I admire
Jules.
your work, Miguel. It's my great pleasure to have a chance to slow down with you, and you just keep up your great work, and it's been a real treat to slow down. Thanks.
Yep. So have a good one, Jules. I'll talk to you later on Twitter, or X as it's called now. And follow Jules on Twitter and X. We'll tweet about it on the podcast. So if you want to follow about all the things happening in the Olympics in the next 4 years. All right. Thank you, Jules. Have a good one.
You too, Miguel.
Bye-bye.